Snow fell quietly over the frozen lake house as laughter echoed inside until she said it. My sister's Prettier. It was meant to be a joke. It always was. The kind that hides years of being second. Across the room, the single dad Ethan Cole looked up from his daughter's scarf, eyes unreadable. Elena smiled, waiting for agreement. Waiting for the small, familiar sting of confirmation she had taught herself to absorb without flinching. Instead, his voice cut through the warmth like winter air. Cold, calm, final. I was never looking at her. The room froze, because suddenly, it wasn't a joke anymore. And no one, not her father, not her sister, was ready for what came next. The lake house had always been beautiful in a way that felt designed to intimidate. Elena Voss stood at the end of the gravel drive, her carry-on bag tilted against her leg, and looked at the building the way she looked at all structures she had not designed herself. Carefully, critically, noting the choices that had been made and the ones that hadn't. The cedar cladding was good. The cantilever over the lower deck was ambitious, but executed without confidence. The beam proportions were wrong, and whoever had approved the drawings hadn't caught it. She caught it in under 4 seconds. She always caught things. It had never made anyone love her more. The Harlow Lake property had been in her mother's family for 2 generations, which meant it technically belonged to all 3 of them: Elena, her younger sister Serena, and their father, Victor Voss. Victor had inherited the legal authority over it when Elena's mother passed 8 years ago, and he had exercised that authority the way he exercised most things. Quietly, completely, without consultation. The property was beautiful in the specific way of things that have been well maintained but never loved. Every surface attended to, every repair made promptly, the grounds seasonally appropriate, and the dock boards replaced on schedule, but nothing about it felt inhabited. Nothing about it felt chosen. It was the kind of place that existed to be owned rather than lived in, and it had always made Elena feel, when she arrived, that she was entering a balance sheet rather than a home. Elena had not been invited this year. She had been summoned. The difference mattered. She rolled her bag up the path, gravel crunching under her boots, and pushed through the wide cedar door into the main hall. The smell hit her first wood smoke and pine boughs, and the particular cold sweetness of a house that had been opened after sitting sealed through early December. Someone had placed a vase of white branches on the entryway table. It was either Serena or someone Serena had hired. Elena. Her father's voice came from the sitting room before she had set her bag down. Victor Voss was 62 years old and had never once looked surprised to see anyone. He sat in the leather wingback near the fire, reading glasses low on his nose, a sheaf of papers on his knee. He looked at her the way he looked at quarterly reports, assessing, expecting deficiency, ready to annotate. "You look tired," he said. "I drove 4 hours." Serena flew. She looked fine. Elena set her bag by the stairs. She did not answer. Serena appeared from the kitchen doorway a moment later with a glass of white wine already in hand, cheeks warm from the fire, wearing a cashmere sweater the color of cream. She was 28 to Elena's 33, and she had always occupied rooms differently, filling them, drawing energy toward her, being naturally where the light fell. "You made it." Serena kissed her cheek. Her perfume was soft and expensive. "We were starting to think you'd cancel. I said I'd come. You say a lot of things." She said it lightly, smiling, the way she always softened her edges. Elena didn't answer that either. The other guests arrived in the next hour. One of her father's colleagues and his wife, gray-haired, pleasant, forgettable in the way of men who had spent 40 years being pleasant at other people's events. A neighbor from the East Shore who came every year. And then, last, a man Elena didn't recognize. Tall, unhurried, carrying a child on his hip with the easy familiarity of someone who had been doing it long enough that it no longer required thought. He was perhaps 38 or 39. Dark coat, dark scarf. A face that didn't perform anything. The child, a girl, 6 or 7, with his coloring and serious eyes, held a stuffed rabbit against her chest and looked around the room with the careful attention of someone new to a place and determined to understand it. Victor met them at the door. "Ethan, good of you to make the drive. Thank you for having us." His voice was even. Not warm, not cold, calibrated. "This is my daughter, Maisie." He set the girl down, and she stood very straight, the rabbit tucked under one arm. "She won't be any trouble." "Of course not." Victor looked at the child the way he looked at most things that weren't immediately useful. "There's a room for her on the upper floor. Ethan Cole." Elena turned the name over in her mind. Her father had mentioned hiring an outside consultant, someone to review the restructuring agreement for the Voss family property holdings before the new year. She had assumed it would be a gray-suited attorney from a firm she'd never deal with. She had not assumed this. He crossed the room, nodded once to the neighbor, once to the colleague, and then his eyes moved to Elena, paused for exactly 2 seconds, and moved on. She watched him settle on the edge of the sofa, Maisie climbing into his lap, small fingers already unknotting his scarf. He let her. Something about the small, unceremonious nature of that gesture, the way he simply held still and allowed it, was the first thing in 4 hours that had felt entirely genuine. Elena looked away. Outside, the lake was already dark, the ice silent and white beyond the glass. Snow was beginning to fall again, fine and steady, the kind that didn't announce itself. Victor cleared his throat from his chair. "We'll have dinner at 7, he said. "I want everyone sharp." It was the same tone he used for board meetings. Elena picked up her bag and carried it upstairs alone. Dinner was set in the main dining room, under the antler chandelier that Elena had always hated and her mother had always defended. The table had been extended to seat 9. Candles had been lit. The housekeeper, a quiet woman named Bet, who came with the property, had roasted lamb and brought it out in silence. Serena sat across from their father and sparkled in the way she did at every table, every gathering, every room she entered. She had a gift for it, remembering names, touching arms at precisely the right moment, asking questions that made people feel seen. Victor watched her with a satisfaction he had never managed to suppress around her. It was the look of a man pleased with an investment. Elena sat at the end of the table. She ate her lamb. She answered when spoken to. She watched the snow fall beyond the long windows and listened to Serena charm Victor's colleague into laughing with his whole body. Ethan sat midway down the table. He cut his food without ceremony. He responded to questions briefly and without expanding. He said something quiet to Maisie when she reached across the table, and she corrected herself without argument. He was watching the room. Elena recognized the habit because she had it too. The practiced stillness of someone who had learned that observation was more reliable than participation. The conversation turned, as it always did, to Serena, her recent work on the Harlow Point redevelopment, her committee involvement, the profile piece in a regional architecture magazine that had mentioned her twice. Victor repeated this fact with the careful casualness of a man who had practiced saying it. Serena deflected with charming modesty, and then said something that redirected the praise back to Victor, and he accepted it the way he always did, as his due. Elena watched her lamb. She was not jealous of Serena. She had stopped being jealous years ago when she realized jealousy required a kind of investment in the competition that she no longer had energy for. What she felt instead was quieter and harder to name, a specific tiredness, the particular exhaustion of someone who has been running a race no one told her she was supposed to want to win. Victor's colleague turned to Elena, then kindly, the way people did when they remembered she was there. "And you're in architecture as well, Elena? Structural design?" "Yes. Commercial, primarily. Anything I'd know?" She named 2 buildings. He nodded without recognition. She had not expected recognition. Serena laughed softly across the table. "Elena's always been the serious one. I'm the one who has to be reminded to smile in photographs." She turned to Elena with an expression of fond, gentle condescension. "You used to get so annoyed at family photos. Remember? Dad would say to smile, and she made a face. Flat, deadpan. The table laughed. Victor smiled. Elena looked down. And then she looked up, and the years of it, the dinner tables and the family photos, and the "you look tired" and the quiet, sustained comparison compressed into one moment. She looked at Serena and she smiled, the way she had learned to smile, and she said it. My sister's prettier, anyway. She had said versions of it before. A deflection. A preemptive strike against her own importance. The kind of joke that lands because everyone already believed it. She said it into the candlelight, into the warmth, into the 10 seconds of laughter that were supposed to follow. And across the table, Ethan Cole looked up from his daughter's scarf. He had been adjusting the knot at the back. The child had turned in her chair to show him something on the window, and the scarf had slipped. He had been fixing it with patient, quiet concentration, and then he stopped. He looked at Elena, not at Serena, not at the table. At Elena. His face was unreadable, but he was looking at her, and the attention in it was different from the polite attention of the colleague or the studied attention of her father. It had weight. The silence stretched one beat too long. I was never looking at her. 4 words. Even, low, unhurried. Not performative. Not a compliment engineered to land in front of an audience. Just a statement. The colleague blinked. Victor's expression shifted barely, but Elena had been reading that face for 33 years, and she caught it. Serena's smile held, but her eyes moved to Ethan with a new sharpness. Ethan looked back down at Maisie's scarf and finished adjusting it. The table did not recover its warmth for the rest of the meal. Elena set down her fork, very carefully, and did not speak again. But something in her chest had shifted. Not dramatically. Not with ceremony. The way ice shifts on water that has begun to move beneath it, too slow to see, too real to miss. He found her in the library the following morning. Elena had been there since 6, sitting at the wide oak table with her laptop and a cup of coffee that had gone cold. The property files her father had sent her 3 weeks ago were spread across the table. She had printed them, which Victor had criticized as inefficient, and marked them up in blue ink, which he had criticized as excessive. She had kept doing it anyway. She was not reviewing them for Victor. She was reviewing them because she did not trust them, and she had not trusted them since the moment she'd seen the structure of the subsidiary agreement on page 43. Ethan knocked once on the open door and waited. "I'm working," she said. "I know." He came in anyway, which should have irritated her and somehow didn't. He carried his own folder thicker than hers, black, tabbed. He set it on the table with the careful placement of someone who spent a great deal of time managing information. "Page 43, he said. She looked up. The subordination clause. He pulled the chair out across from her and sat down. "You've already found it." It wasn't a question. "Found it 3 weeks ago," she said. "I've been trying to determine whether it's what I think it is." "It is." He opened his folder to a tabbed section and turned it to face her. "Your father structured the lending agreement through a holding entity that he controls independently of the family trust. The clause subordinates your company's receivables to any outstanding obligations held by that entity, which means if he calls in the note, my accounts freeze and the subordinate claim transfers." She stared at the page. "He's been building this for how long?" "At least 14 months, possibly longer." He did not soften it. He said it the same way he would say the weather. As a fact, present and relevant. Elena sat back. Outside, the lake was white and motionless in the morning light. The snow from last night had settled over everything. "Why are you showing me this?" He was quiet for a moment, not evasive, processing. "Because I was hired to review the restructuring agreement," he said. "My job is accurate assessment. This is material to an accurate assessment. You were hired by my father. I was hired by the estate. Your name is on the estate documents." She looked at him. He looked back at her with the same calibrated directness he'd used at dinner. No performance, no charm, no effort to be anything other than what he was. "What happens if I do nothing?" she asked. He activates the clause at his discretion. You have no legal recourse under the current structure. And if I move to restructure before he acts, then you have approximately 6 weeks before the holiday audit window closes and the clause becomes irrevocable. Elena pulled the folder toward her and began reading. Ethan did not leave. He sat across from her and worked in silence on his own materials, and neither of them spoke for the better part of an hour. She refilled her coffee without offering him any and then, without looking up, refilled his. He didn't comment on it, he just drank it. Outside, Maisie had appeared on the lower deck in a red coat, throwing snow against the railing in handfuls and watching it scatter. Her face was completely absorbed in the activity. Elena watched her for a moment through the window, the pure, uncomplicated pleasure of a child alone with snow, and then looked back at her documents. Ethan followed her gaze for a beat. His expression did not change, but it softened in some way that didn't show on his face something in the set of his shoulders. The slight release of tension she hadn't known he was carrying. He looked back down at his papers. They worked in silence until Bet came to announce breakfast, and Maisie's red coat appeared at the library doorway, cheeks bright, rabbit dangling from one hand. "Dad." She held up the rabbit. "Sophie fell in the snow. We'll dry her off." He rose without ceremony and took Sophie in one hand and his daughter's hand in the other. He paused at the doorway and looked back at Elena. "I'll have the full analysis ready by this afternoon." "I'll be here," she said. He nodded once and left. Elena looked down at the folder he had left behind. Open. Tabbed. The page marked with a precise, clean blue pen, the same color as hers. The storm came in the afternoon. The Harlow Township Community Board held its quarterly review in the meeting room above the hardware store, 20 minutes from the lakehouse by Winding Road, which, in a January snowstorm, meant 45 and uncertain. Victor had been anticipating this meeting. He had been anticipating it for weeks. He wanted the rezoning approved. More specifically, he wanted Elena's current project, a mixed-use development she had designed and contracted on the South Shore parcel, reclassified under a commercial zoning category that would require her to renegotiate her permits, delay her timeline by at least 8 months, and return to the board for reapproval. The reclassification would be proposed by Victor's long-standing friend on the board, who owed Victor a favor of the professional variety. Elena knew this. She had known it since September, when her attorney flagged the preliminary motion. She did not know that Ethan had asked to attend. The meeting room was wood-paneled and fluorescent lit and smelled of old coffee and folding chairs. 7 board members, 11 citizens. Elena sat in the second row with her rolled blueprints and her laptop. Serena sat beside Victor in the front row, dressed for it, present as a symbol of family unity. The motion was introduced 20 minutes in. Victor's friend presented it with the smoothness of a prepared argument, citing 3 municipal codes that, read in isolation, could support his case. Victor did not look at Elena. Elena opened her laptop. "I'd like to respond," she said. The chair acknowledged her. She stood. She had prepared for this. She had cross-referenced the codes, pulled the 2019 precedent ruling, printed the site surveys. She had been ready for months. She began speaking, and the room shifted its attention. And then, from the back row, a voice. "If I may add something." Ethan stood. He had a printed document in one hand and the particular stillness of someone who was not nervous and had no reason to be. The chair nodded. "I'm Ethan Cole. I've been retained to review the estate holding structure that underlies this property parcel." He set the printed document on the board table. The motion as presented relies on a municipal classification that was superseded by the 2021 Infrastructure Addendum Section 14, which specifically exempts mixed-use residential adjacent parcels under 3 acres from retroactive commercial reclassification. He paused. "This parcel is 2.8 acres. The motion doesn't apply." Silence. Victor's friend looked at his papers. The board chair leaned over to read the document. Victor looked at Ethan for the first time with an expression Elena had only seen him use on subordinates who had surprised him. Cold, recalibrating, not yet decided. Ethan sat down. The motion was tabled. Elena stood in the parking lot afterward in the snow, her blueprints under one arm, and watched the board members filter out. Ethan came out 3 minutes after her, Maisie beside him, pulling her hat down over her ears. She looked at him. "How long have you been planning that?" she asked. "Since this morning." He adjusted Maisie's hat. "The addendum wasn't in your file. I found it cross-referencing the property survey. You could have told me before the meeting. I found it 40 minutes before the meeting." She looked at him for a moment. Snow was falling on his dark coat and he didn't move to brush it off. "Thank you," she said. He didn't say "you're welcome." He looked at her with the same direct, undressed attention he'd had at dinner, and said, "Don't thank me yet." That was the first move. He put his hand on Maisie's shoulder and walked toward the car. Elena stood in the parking lot until his taillights disappeared into the storm. Victor was not a man who showed anger. He redirected it. 3 days after the board meeting, he called a family gathering in the main sitting room, not a meeting, because Victor never called meetings when a gathering sufficed. He poured drinks, he sat in his wingback. He was genial in the practiced way of someone who had decided on his next move and was simply delivering it. "I've been thinking," he said, "about the stewardship of Voss family interests going forward." He looked at Serena. "I'd like to formalize your role as co-director of the property holdings, beginning in the new year." Serena looked at her glass. Elena looked at her father. "That position currently sits with me," she said, "and you've done a fine job." He said it warmly, which was how he said things he didn't mean, but with your current project load and the complexity of the restructuring, it makes sense to distribute the responsibility. Serena's community relationships are excellent. Her instincts are good. And frankly, he paused with the air of a man selecting his words. A fresh perspective would benefit everyone. Serena did not look up. "I don't need to be replaced to add a co-director," Elena said. "That's not what I said. That's what you proposed?" Victor's expression did not change. "This is a family discussion. Then why is the decision already made?" The room held its breath. Victor set down his glass with a precise, deliberate sound. "I think you're reading this as adversarial," he said. "That's your pattern, Elena." She stood. She excused herself before he could finish the sentence, because she had learned 30 years ago that nothing that followed "that's your pattern" was worth hearing, and she was out of practice with absorbing it gracefully. She walked through the kitchen and out the side door. The cold hit her immediately, the hard, clean cold of a lakehouse January after dark. She had left her coat inside. She walked to the edge of the patio anyway, and stood with her hands at her sides and her breath making shapes in the dark air. She heard the door behind her. Ethan came out without a word. He stood beside her for a moment, not touching, looking at the lake. Then he took off his coat and held it out. She didn't take it immediately. He kept holding it. She took it. She put it on, and he stood beside her in his sweater in the cold, with the same composed indifference to discomfort that she was beginning to recognize as characteristic. He crossed his arms, looked at the ice, and said nothing, which was, she thought, the correct thing to say. After a while he said, "What do you want to do? Not what should you do? Not I know what you should do." "I don't know yet," she said. "You have time. Not much. Enough." He looked at her sideways. The patio light caught the edges of his face, the steadiness in it. He moved because the board meeting didn't go the way he planned. That's reactive. Reactive people make mistakes. She pulled his coat tighter around her shoulders. "Why do you care?" she asked. Not harshly. Genuinely. He was quiet long enough that she thought he wouldn't answer. "I don't like watching people get taken apart by the people who are supposed to protect them," he said. "I've seen it before." He said it without self-pity and without drama. The way people speak about things that have cost them something real. She didn't ask him to elaborate. They stood in the cold together until Maisie's face appeared in the kitchen window, frowning at them with exaggerated concern, and Ethan raised one hand at her. "I'm here." She pressed her palm flat to the glass. He held his hand steady until she stepped back. "She worries?" Elena said. "She's 7, he said. "She's learned to." Elena handed him back his coat. They went inside separately. The ice was thick enough to walk on. Elena knew because she had tested it that afternoon with a long stick, the way her mother had taught her patient percussion, listening for the change. The lake held. She went out after 11, when the house was quiet. She wore her coat this time, and her warmest boots, and she walked to the end of the dock that extended over the frozen water and sat on the bench at the end of it. The stars were very bright. The ice was white and blue and utterly still. She heard his footsteps on the dock planks 10 minutes later. He sat down beside her with a thermos. He poured, without asking, handed her a cup. Coffee. Black. She drank it. "Maisie's asleep," he said. "I wasn't worried about Maisie. I know. A beat. She sleeps like a stone once she's out. First hour is the hard part." Elena looked at the ice. "How long has it been just the two of you?" 4 years. He said it simply. "That's young." She didn't ask for more. He didn't offer it. The silence was the kind that doesn't need to be filled. After a while, she said, "My mother used to bring me out here when I was small. Before Serena was born. Before everything calcified." She paused. "I used to think if I worked hard enough, I'd earn my way into the room, into the family. Whatever it was, I was supposed to be earning." She looked at her cup. "I'm 33 years old and I still don't know what I was supposed to be earning." He was looking at the ice. He didn't say "I'm sorry" or "that sounds hard" or any of the other phrases people reached for when they didn't know what else to do. He said, "You're not the one they think you are." 7 words. Flat. Direct. She turned to look at him. "The version they have of you," he said. "The daughter who's second, who works too seriously, who doesn't smile in photographs. That's not you. That's a role they wrote and handed you, and you've been trying to fit it because it was easier than fighting it." She was very still. "How do you know?" she asked. "Because the woman who caught a beam proportion error in 4 seconds, who marked up 40 pages in blue ink because she doesn't trust what she hasn't verified, who walked out into the cold rather than absorb another correction without armor." He looked at her. "That's not someone who's second." The stars reflected dimly off the ice. She breathed slowly. The things people say when they want to hurt you, she had learned, rarely feel like weapons when they arrive. They feel like corrections. Like small, necessary adjustments. You spend years absorbing them until they become the architecture of the story. You tell yourself this is who you are, this is what you are worth, this is the room you are allowed to occupy. And the insidious thing, the thing she had never quite been able to articulate, was that the story felt true. Felt earned, because the people telling it were the people who were supposed to know her best. She had never said any of this out loud. "It doesn't change anything," she said instead. "What you think of me." "No," he agreed. "But it changes what you think of you." Eventually, she looked at him for a long time. He looked back without flinching, without performing, without making it anything other than what it was. There was something almost unsettling about being looked at that directly she kept expecting, the look to shift into something familiar. Assessment, comparison, polite diminishment. It didn't. The thermos sat between them on the bench, steam drifting upward from the lip and dispersing into the cold. "Your daughter has your eyes," she said finally. "I know." Something shifted in his expression, not a smile. "Exactly. But the place a smile comes from. She also has my habit of watching before she speaks, which makes parent-teacher conferences interesting." Elena looked at the ice. "I bet she's extraordinary." "She's 7, he said. Again. Softer this time. They sat until the cold became unavoidable, and then they walked back to the house in silence. their footsteps on the dock planks, steady and unhurried. At the door, she looked at him. "Thank you," she said. "For the coffee." He nodded once. His hand was on the door. "Elena," he said. She stopped. "6 weeks," he said. "That's what you have. Don't spend them waiting." He opened the door and held it. She went inside. It happened on a Thursday morning. Elena sat at the library table with her laptop, waiting for the quarterly payment from the Hendricks contract to clear a routine transfer, $42,000, the last installment on a 18-month project. She refreshed the account portal. Transaction declined. Account access restricted pending review. She refreshed again. The same message. She called her bank. She was transferred 3 times and placed on hold for 11 minutes, and then connected to a compliance officer who told her, in the careful, neutral language of someone reading from a script, that a subordination notice had been filed against her business accounts by a holding entity called Lakeside Capital Holdings, LLC. "When?" she asked. "Filed at 9:02 this morning." She closed the laptop. Lakeside Capital Holdings. She looked it up in 2 minutes. Registered 14 months ago. Primary officer, Victor Voss. Her father had moved. She sat for a moment with her hands flat on the table and her breathing deliberately even. The room was very quiet. Outside, Maisie was on the lower deck again with a collection of small stones she was arranging in patterns on the railing. Elena picked up her phone and sent one message. He activated it. Lakeside Capital. This morning, the reply came in under a minute. "I know. I'm already working. Don't move anything. Don't call your attorney yet." She stared at the message. "Then, where are you?" "Be there in 10 minutes. He was there in 8. He came into the library with his black folder and sat down across from her and opened it to a section she hadn't seen. He turned it to face her. 4 pages, dense with numbers and annotations. "He moved faster than I expected," he said. It was an acknowledgement, not an apology. "But he moved before the window closed, which means he's nervous. Nervous people activate early." He pointed to the top of the first page. "The subordination is valid under the current structure. But the current structure has a defect." She leaned forward. "The holding entity was registered under a Delaware filing," he said. "But the subordination clause in your lending agreement specifies that any enforcement action must comply with the state law governing the underlying property. The property is in this state. Delaware subordination filings don't automatically transfer enforcement rights across state lines without a secondary registration, which..." He turned to the 3rd page. Lakeside Capital Holdings never completed. She read the page. "Twice. That's the defect," she said. "That's the defect." He looked at her steadily. "It doesn't solve everything, but it buys time. And time, right now, is the material thing." She sat back. Her hands were not shaking, but they wanted to. She pressed them flat on the table. Serena knocked on the doorframe. She had been quiet since the sitting room conversation. Elena had watched her over the past 3 days, the way she moved through the house more carefully than usual, the way she didn't sit next to Victor at dinner, the way she looked at their father sometimes when he wasn't watching, with an expression that was not the fond compliance Elena had always attributed to her. Serena came in and sat down in the chair beside Elena, which she had never done before in her life. "I didn't know," she said. Elena looked at her. "About Lakeside. About the clause. I didn't know any of it." Serena's voice was careful and very controlled. "I want you to know that." Elena looked at her for a long moment. "I know," she said. And she thought she did. Serena looked at Ethan. "What do you need?" He looked at her for a moment, assessing. "Everything you have from Dad on the restructuring timeline," he said. "Emails, texts, anything he sent you about the property holdings in the last 18 months. She nodded once, stood, and left. Elena looked at Ethan. "You expected that," she said. "I thought it was possible." He closed the folder. She's been watching him the same way you have, just from a different angle. Jonas Reed had worked for Victor Voss for 6 years before Victor had made the mistake of involving him in the lakeside structure. Jonas was meticulous, deeply conscientious, and possessed of the particular personal ethics of someone who had grown up poor enough that dishonesty had never seemed like an option worth the risk. He had not understood, when he filed the initial documents, exactly what they were part of. He had understood 3 months later, when he'd seen the full picture. He had kept a copy. He arrived at the lakehouse on Saturday morning uninvited, unannounced, driving a sensible gray sedan with a broken defroster and wearing the expression of a man who had made a decision and was following it through before he lost his nerve. Elena met him at the door. She had not known he was coming. Neither had Ethan, but he was in the library when Jonas walked in, and he recognized him immediately with a quiet nod that suggested this was not entirely a surprise. "I called him," Ethan said. Elena looked between them. "I've known Jonas for 3 years," Ethan said. "He handled the legal filing for Lakeside. I had a conversation with him yesterday." He looked at Jonas. "You brought it?" Jonas set a manila envelope on the table. Inside, a USB drive, a printed email chain, 17 pages, 2 PDF exports of internal transaction records. "The email chain is between your father and the attorney who structured the subordination clause," Jonas said. He sat down, and the expression of a man following through on a decision settled into something quieter. The expression of someone who has already paid the cost in anticipation and is simply completing the transaction. The third email, dated November of last year, is Victor outlining the intended activation timeline. "He planned this before you signed the amended trust agreement." Elena looked at the page. The email was clear. It was methodical. It had the particular unsentimental quality of her father's thinking, strategic, forward-projected, unencumbered by the specific humans involved. He had structured this before she'd signed. He had watched her sign it. Ethan was already reading. He went through the chain with the focused speed of someone who read financial documents the way other people read novels, not linearly, but by pattern, by implication, by what the gap said. Outside, the storm that had been building since morning finally arrived. Snow hit the windows in horizontal sheets. The lake disappeared into white. "The email chain establishes intent," Ethan said. "Combined with the defective secondary registration, it creates a strong case for fraudulent inducement, which means the original subordination agreement could be challenged as void." "Could be," Jonas said, "or would be." Ethan looked at him. "Would be." With the right filing. Elena was quiet. She looked at the email chain, at her father's precise, unhurried sentences, at the attorney's confirmatory replies, at the documented mechanics of something that had been built around her while she was working, while she was driving to family dinners, while she was standing in this house being told she looked tired. "He counted on me not looking closely enough," she said. "Yes," Ethan said. "He's always counted on that." Ethan looked at her. He was wrong. The storm pressed against the glass. Elena picked up the printed pages and began reading from the beginning, blue pen in hand, and the room settled into the particular focused quiet of people doing necessary work. They waited until Sunday evening, not for theater for precision. Sunday evening, Victor would be relaxed. The week's business settled. His guard, as much as Victor Voss ever had a guard, appropriately distributed, and Ethan had spent Saturday night and Sunday morning completing the filing documentation and having a 40-minute phone call with an attorney in the state capitol who specialized in fraudulent inducement cases. The dining room. Bet had set the table for dinner, candles, as before. Lamb again. The chandelier cast its amber light across the mahogany surface. Victor sat at the head, genial, satisfied. Serena sat to his left, her face composed, her hands in her lap. Elena sat down across from her father. Ethan sat at the end. Victor poured wine and looked at the table with the contentment of a man who believed the game was over. "I want to discuss the formalization of Serena's co-directorship," he said. Now that the new year is approaching, I think. Before that, Ethan said. Victor looked at him. I have some materials to review with the family. He opened the black folder and placed the first document on the table, centered, within everyone's sight. The formation documents for Lakeside Capital Holdings, LLC. Victor's expression did not change. He was too controlled for that. The second document is the email chain between you and your attorney, dated November of last year, outlining the intended activation of the subordination clause and the timeline for executing it. He placed the email chain beside the first document. The third is the cross-state registration defect, which renders the enforcement action legally invalid under the governing state law. Silence. The fourth is the fraudulent inducement filing, which was submitted to the court this morning. Victor looked at him for a long time. You were hired by this family, Victor said. I was retained by the estate. Elena's name is on the estate documents. He said it without emphasis. I reviewed the estate. This is my review. Victor's jaw moved. He was recalculating. Elena could see it, the way she had always been able to see it, the way a machine recalibrates when its input has changed. The court filing is preliminary, Victor said. It can be contested. It can, Ethan agreed. The email chain makes that difficult. The documentation is complete. Ethan. Mr. Voss. Still even, still unhurried. You structured a financial trap around your daughter, using her own company's receivables as collateral, with the intent to transfer controlling interest to yourself without her knowledge. The documentation establishes that, clearly. He looked at Victor without anger, without triumph, with the same calibrated directness he brought to everything. The question now is how this proceeds. Serena placed an envelope on the table. She did not look at her father when she did it. She placed it precisely, flat, at the center of the table, and she folded her hands in her lap and looked at the candle flame. Victor looked at the envelope. That contains every document he sent me regarding the property restructuring over the past 18 months, Serena said. Her voice was very steady. I've had copies made. Victor looked at his younger daughter. Elena watched him. She had imagined this moment before, not this specific version of it, but some version, some reckoning. And she had always imagined feeling something large, some flood of vindication or grief. What she felt instead was quiet. Still, the particular stillness of a lake after the storm has passed and the surface has had time to settle. Victor looked at the documents, at Ethan, at Serena, at Elena. He looked at Elena for a long moment. And in that look, she was 33 years old, and she had been reading that face her entire life. She saw the things she had never quite been able to name. Not contempt, not indifference, but something worse and more precise. Recognition. He had always known exactly what he was doing. He had calculated that she would be too occupied with the actual work of her life, the projects, the documents, the buildings she built with careful, verifiable precision to look up and see the walls being constructed around her. He had been wrong. Not about the walls. The walls had been real, and the construction had been careful, and she had nearly not seen them in time. He had been wrong about her, in the end. About what she would do when she saw them. About who would be standing beside her. About whether she would be alone. He picked up the pen that Bet had placed with the place settings, and he signed. The scratch of it across the paper was very quiet. The candles did not waver. Outside the storm glass, the snow fell without comment. The storm ended in the night. Elena stood on the lower deck in the morning and watched it. The specific quality of post-storm light over snow, which was different from any other light. Softer, more honest, without the hard angles of sun on dry surfaces. Everything was covered. The lake was invisible under white. The dock extended into it, the wooden planks blanketed, and the bench at the end held a drift of snow shaped like something a child might have built with her arms. The house behind her was quiet. Victor had left that morning. Early, without ceremony, with 2 bags and his phone against his ear, and the particular posture of a man rerouting. He had not said goodbye to Elena. He had paused in the doorway where Serena stood and looked at her, and Serena had looked back, and something had passed between them that was not forgiveness and was not dismissal, something more complicated and more honest than either. The Hendricks payment cleared at 9:17. Serena brought her coffee at 9:20 and sat beside her on the deck steps, and they watched the lake in something that was not quite silence. There were birds somewhere in the pines, and the sound of snow shifting from branches but was close enough. "I didn't know he had it in him," Serena said. "Which part?" "Any of it. The lakeside structure, the timeline." She wrapped both hands around her mug. "I knew things were complicated. I told myself complicated was different from." She stopped. "It wasn't different," Elena said. "No." A pause. "I'm sorry." Elena looked at the lake. "For what, specifically?" Serena was quiet. "For taking up all the light." Elena looked at her. Her sister's face was composed and tired and genuinely sorry in a way that had nothing performative about it. "You didn't take it," Elena said. "It was given to you. That's different." They sat until their coffee was gone, and Maisie came through the door behind them in her red coat, Sophie the rabbit under one arm, looking at the snow with the expression of someone who has a great deal to accomplish. "Can I go on the ice?" she asked. "With supervision," Ethan said behind her. He came out with his own coffee and stood at the railing, looking at the lake. He looked, as he always looked, like someone who had arrived at the place he meant to be. Elena looked at him. "When do you leave?" she asked. "Tuesday. I have a meeting in the city." He looked at her. "You?" "I have a project to get back to. And apparently a company to fully reclaim." He nodded once. The morning was very still. Maisie had navigated the deck stairs with dignified caution and was now standing at the edge of the snow-covered lawn, testing the depth with one boot. Elena looked at the lake and then back at him. "Why did you help me?" she asked. He looked at her in the same way he had looked at her across the dinner table, across the library table, across the dock in the dark, with the same quality of attention that felt like being genuinely seen rather than assessed. "Because you were worth helping," he said. "That's not an answer." "Yes, it is." He looked at the lake, then back at her. And his voice was different still even. Still unhurried, but without the careful calibration she had come to recognize as his professional register. Something underneath it, something he had chosen to let through. "I was never looking at her," he said. It was the sentence from the dinner table. The same words. But here, now, in the morning light, with the snow settled over everything, and the house quiet behind them, it was not the same sentence. It was a statement of intent. It was a choice, made deliberately, in the full knowledge of what it meant. Elena looked at him for a long time. She did not say, "I know." She did not perform being moved by it, though she was. She breathed slowly and looked at the man standing beside her in the post-storm light. The man who had read 40 pages of financial documents at her kitchen table and fixed his daughter's scarf and stood beside her in the cold without speaking, and brought coffee to a frozen dock at 11 at night, and had, in the span of 6 days, done something that 33 years of trying to belong had never managed. He had simply seen her. Without the framework of comparison, without the architecture of the family story, without the role she had been handed and worn until it fit. He had looked at her across a dinner table and told the truth without decoration, and then he had kept telling it, quietly, in the way of a person who tells the truth because they don't know how else to be. She was not, she realized, accustomed to that, and she said, "Okay," one word. Her own kind of statement. His expression moved that place below a smile, that origin point, and he looked back at the lake. Maisie had made it to the ice. She was standing at the edge with the gravity of a 7-year-old who has determined that a thing can be done and is doing it. She looked back at her father and held up Sophie, who had been brought along as a witness. He held up his hand. "I see you." She turned back to the lake, satisfied, and took one careful step forward, and then another, and then stopped and lifted her face to the pale winter sky with an expression of complete, uncomplicated joy. Elena watched her. Something in the watching loosened something in her chest, the same something that had shifted at the dinner table. When a man she didn't know had looked at her and not at her sister, and the world had briefly stopped performing and become, for one unpredictable moment, honest. Then she put down her empty cup, walked down the deck stairs, and stepped out onto the snow. Maisie heard her footsteps and turned. For a moment they regarded each other, the woman who had always been careful and the child who had learned to be, and then Maisie reached out and took Elena's hand. Her small fingers were warm through the knit gloves, entirely trusting, in the way of children who have decided you are safe. She tugged once, toward the ice. Elena went. Behind them, on the deck, Ethan stood with his coffee and watched his daughter pull Elena Voss across the frozen surface of Harlow Lake, and the expression on his face was the one he saved for things that mattered. The snow had stopped. The ice held. The light, particular and honest and without pretense, lay across all of it. The lake, the dock, the house, the two figures on the white expanse below, and the morning was very quiet and very new. Some beginnings don't announce themselves. They arrive the way snow does, silently, while the house is warm and no one is watching, until you step outside and find the world has changed while you were looking the other direction. She had stopped waiting to be told she was worth looking at. She had stopped needing to be.